On the cold gray surface of Epsilon 9, a small moon circling a dying red star, the wind howled like a ghost through broken metal and shattered rock. The sky glowed faintly red, casting long shadows over the ruined research outpost that humans had built there years ago. Now it was a fortress under siege. Outside the cracked dome walls, hundreds of alien war machines crawled like insects across the barren ground. They belonged to the Krell Dominion, a powerful empire that had crushed dozens of worlds without mercy. But here, on this lonely moon, they had met something they did not expect: human soldiers who refused to surrender. Inside the outpost, Corporal Dan Harris wiped sweat from his brow with a torn sleeve. His face was smudged with dirt, his uniform patched in 3 places, and his boots were falling apart. But his eyes were sharp, watching the monitors that showed enemy movements outside. He had been on Epsilon 9 for 6 months, part of a small defense team assigned to protect scientists studying the moon's strange energy readings. When the Krell arrived without warning, the scientists were evacuated, but the soldiers stayed behind. Their orders were simple: hold the line as long as possible. Nearby, Sergeant Lena Ortiz crouched over a broken drone, her fingers moving fast as she rewired its circuits. She was small but tough, with a sharp mind and a dry sense of humor that kept the others going. "If I can get this thing flying again," she muttered, "we might fool those ugly bastards into thinking we've got more troops than we do." Her voice was calm, but everyone knew she hadn't slept in over 30 hours. Still, she worked like she had all the time in the world. Across the room, Lieutenant Kyle Brooks leaned against a wall, checking his sidearm for the 10th time. He was the youngest officer in the group, but he carried himself like a veteran. His dark hair was messy, his jaw set tight. He had lost 2 friends in the first wave of the attack, and he wasn't about to lose anyone else. "Dan," he said quietly, "they're moving again. Looks like they're grouping near Sector 4. Dan nodded. "That's where the old lava vents are. If we can lure them in and trigger a collapse." He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew the risk. The moon's crust was unstable, and one wrong move could bury them all. But it was their only chance. The Krell didn't fight like humans. They came in waves, relentless and silent, their armored bodies built for war. They didn't negotiate. They didn't take prisoners. Once a world fell to them, it vanished from the star maps. That's why Earth Command had told the Epsilon 9 team to expect no rescue. "Hold out as long as you can," the final message had said. "Buy time for the fleet to regroup." No one said how long that might take. Maybe weeks, maybe never. But the humans didn't wait to be crushed. They fought back with everything they had. They turned broken lab equipment into signal jammers. They used the outpost's old mining lasers to cut through enemy armor. They even set traps using leftover fuel cells, rigged to explode when stepped on. Every trick, every scrap of knowledge, every ounce of courage, they used it all. Outside, the Krell commander watched from his command dreadnought hovering in low orbit. General Vraktor was a legend in the Dominion. His name alone made entire planets surrender without a fight. Tall, scarred, with eyes like burning coals, he had never lost a battle. But now, as he stared at the tiny outpost that should have fallen in hours, he felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. His forces had attacked for 3 days straight. They had destroyed the outer defenses, cut off communications, and bombarded the dome with plasma fire. Yet the humans still held the core. Worse, they kept striking back, fast, smart, and fearless. "How many are left down there?" he growled to his aide. "Estimates say fewer than 20, General," the aide replied, voice trembling slightly. "Most are wounded. Supplies are nearly gone." Vraktor narrowed his eyes. "Then why do they not yield?" No one answered. In the Krell way of thinking, survival was the only goal. If defeat was certain, you surrendered or died quickly. But these humans, they did neither. They dug in. They adapted. They turned weakness into weapons. One report even claimed they used music, old Earth songs, to keep their spirits up during the darkest hours. It made no sense. Back inside the outpost, Dan handed out the last of the water rations. Each soldier got 3 sips, no more. "Save your strength," he told a young private named Eli who was shivering from a leg wound. "We've got one more trick to play tonight." Lena finished her work on the drone. It buzzed to life, its single red eye blinking. She smiled faintly. "Meet Betsy. She's gonna fly over the East Ridge and pretend we've got a whole platoon waiting there." Kyle checked the map on his wrist display. "Once they chase Betsy, we hit the vent control panel. If the timing's right, the ground gives way right under them. It's a long shot, Dan said. Everything's a long shot now, Lena replied, loading a rifle with the last of their ammo. Might as well make it a good one. As night fell on Epsilon 9, the humans moved like shadows through the tunnels beneath the outpost. Their breath fogged in the cold air. Their boots made no sound. They knew this was probably their last stand, but none of them complained. None of them asked to quit. They moved because they had to. Because giving up wasn't in them. High above, General Vraktor watched the feed from his drones. He saw the tiny figures slipping through the dark. He saw the drone lift off, wobbling slightly. He saw his own troops shift position, drawn by the fake signal. And then, just as the Krell forces reached the lava field, the ground shook. A deep rumble rolled across the moon. Cracks split the surface. Alien war machines tumbled into the molten depths below, vanishing in clouds of steam and fire. For a long moment, silence filled the command deck. Then Vraktor spoke, his voice low and filled with something like wonder. These human soldiers, they do not break. He turned away from the screen, his mind racing. This was not just resistance. This was something else entirely, something he had never seen before. And for the first time in his life, the great general of the Krell Dominion felt a flicker of fear, not of losing, but of not understanding what he was up against. After the ground swallowed nearly a third of his frontline units, General Vraktor did something no one in the Krell Dominion had ever seen him do. He called a halt to the attack. His warship stopped firing. His ground forces pulled back beyond the lava fields. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. Inside the battered outpost, the human soldiers didn't celebrate. They were too tired, too hurt, too hungry. But they noticed the quiet. Dan Harris stood at a cracked observation window, squinting at the distant shapes of Krell armor now sitting still like statues in the red-tinged dust. They're waiting, he said. Not retreating, just watching. Lena Ortiz sat on an overturned crate, stitching a tear in her jacket with wire. Maybe they finally realized we're not worth the trouble, she said. But her voice lacked hope. She knew better. The Krell didn't give up. They crushed. They erased. They never paused out of kindness. Kyle Brooks paced near the comms console, listening to static. Earth Command hadn't answered in days. He kept trying anyway, sending short bursts of coded messages just in case someone was listening. He didn't expect a reply. He just needed to feel like he was still part of something bigger than this dying moon. High above, aboard his massive command ship, Vraktor sat alone in his war room. The walls were lined with trophies from conquered worlds, shattered banners, broken crowns, data cores from fallen civilizations. But none of them held his attention now. On the main screen, footage played on a loop. Humans dragging wounded comrades through smoke, sharing water from a single canteen, laughing weakly over a broken joke. It made no sense. In Krell culture, weakness was discarded. Soldiers who couldn't fight were left behind. But these humans carried their injured. They slowed down for them. They risked their lives for people who couldn't even stand. He summoned his chief xenopsychologist, a thin, pale scholar named Zelik, who had studied a dozen species before this. "Explain this," Vraktor demanded, pointing to a clip of Dan giving his last protein bar to a young private with a bandaged arm. Zelik adjusted his spectacles. "From what our scans and intercepted comms suggest, humans operate on a principle called unit cohesion. They form deep emotional bonds with their fellow soldiers. They see each other not just as tools of war, but as family." "Family?" Vraktor snorted. "That is not strategy. That is sentiment. Sentiment gets warriors killed, perhaps," Zelik said carefully, "but it also makes them unpredictable. They do not calculate risk the way we do. They act out of loyalty, not logic, and that makes them far more dangerous than a purely rational enemy." Vraktor fell silent. He remembered his own youth, trained from birth to obey, to dominate, to never show doubt. He had never questioned his orders. He had never shared his rations. He had never stayed behind for a fallen comrade, because in the Krell way, if you fell, you were already dead. But these humans, they treated their fallen like they still mattered, even in death. He ordered new surveillance drones launched, small, silent, cloaked in thermal shadow. They drifted down to the outpost like dust motes, recording everything. He watched Lena spend hours rewiring a damaged power relay, her hands shaking from exhaustion but never stopping. He saw Kyle sit with a dying soldier, holding his hand until the breathing stopped. He saw Dan stand guard all night, even though he hadn't slept in 2 days just so others could rest. One night, as the red star dipped below the horizon, Fraktor saw something that made him lean forward. The humans had gathered in the main chamber. They weren't planning an attack. They weren't fixing weapons. They were singing, quietly, softly, a song in a language his translator struggled with. It was slow and sad, but there was warmth in it. One of them played a small harmonica. Another tapped a rhythm on a metal can. They weren't celebrating. They were remembering home, remembering people they'd lost. And in that moment, they weren't soldiers. They were just people far from everything they loved, holding on to each other. Fraktor turned off the feed. His chest felt tight, though he didn't know why. He had seen billions die without blinking. But this quiet act of defiance through song, unsettled him more than any battle cry. Back on the surface, the humans didn't know they were being watched so closely. They only knew they were running out of time. Food was gone. Medical supplies were empty. The air recyclers were failing. Yet they kept going. Lena managed to patch the main shield generator using parts from a broken rover. Kyle organized a new patrol schedule so no one collapsed from fatigue. Dan kept morale up with stories from Earth, about beaches, baseball games, late-night diners with endless coffee. One morning, as Dan handed out melted ice water, Eli, the young private with the leg wound, asked, "Do you think anyone's coming for us?" Dan didn't lie. "Probably not," he said. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting." Eli nodded slowly. "Then I'll fight too, even if I can only crawl." That simple exchange, caught by a hidden drone, was later replayed 3 times in Fraktor's private chamber. He couldn't understand it. Why would a wounded soldier choose to fight when survival was impossible? Why would his comrades let him? In the Krell way, such a soldier would be a burden. But here he was part of the team. His will mattered. Fraktor called Zelik again. "Is this normal for humans, this refusal to accept defeat?" "It is more than refusal," Zelik said. "It is identity. To them, giving up is worse than dying. They measure worth not by victory, but by how they stand when all seems lost." The general stared out the viewport at the tiny moon below. For the first time, he wondered if the Krell had been wrong about something fundamental. Maybe strength wasn't just power in numbers. Maybe it was also heart. Maybe it was also choice. He gave a new order. No more attacks. No more bombardments. Just watch, learn, understand. His officers were confused. Some whispered that the general had gone soft. But none dared question him aloud. Inside the outpost, the humans noticed the change. The enemy wasn't advancing. Drones hovered at a distance but didn't fire. It felt like the calm before a storm. But days passed and the storm never came. Lena frowned at the monitors. "They're studying us," she said. "Let them," Kyle replied. "Maybe they'll learn we're not just targets." Dan looked out the window again. The Krell ship still hung in the sky like dark clouds. But something had shifted. He couldn't name it. He only knew that for now they were still alive. And as long as they breathed, they would stand together. High above, General Fraktor watched them once more. He no longer saw pests to be crushed. He saw something rare, something strange, something he could not yet define, but he knew it was powerful. And for the first time, he did not feel the urge to destroy it. He wanted to understand it, because if a species could fight like this with nothing left, what could they do with everything? The silence from the Krell lasted 5 days. No attacks, no messages, just the red sky and the distant hum of enemy ships hanging in orbit like vultures waiting for death. Inside the outpost, the humans were running on fumes. Food was gone. Water came from melted ice scraped off the walls. The air smelled stale, thick with sweat and burnt wiring. But they were alive. And they were thinking. Lena Ortiz sat cross-legged on the floor, her eyes fixed on a flickering screen showing energy readings from the Krell forward base. She had been watching it for hours, not sleeping, barely blinking. Something didn't add up. Every time the Krell rotated their guard shifts, always at the same time like clockwork, their shield emitters pulsed in a strange rhythm. It wasn't random. It was a pattern. "A weakness, Dan," she called, her voice hoarse. "Come look at this." Dan Harris shuffled over, his boots dragging. He hadn't shaved in a week, and dark circles ringed his eyes. He peered at the screen. "What am I seeing?" "They're shields," Lena said, pointing with a dirty finger. Every time they change shifts, the emitters sync to a low-frequency pulse for exactly 12 seconds. It's like they're resetting the system. During that window, the shield is weakest, almost off. Kyle Brooks joined them, arms crossed. "You're saying we can punch through?" "Not punch," Lena said. "Slip. If we hit them right during that 12-second gap, we might disable their main power grid without blowing up half the moon." Dan rubbed his chin. "But how do we get close enough to plant charges? They've got patrols everywhere." Lena smiled faintly. "We don't go in. We send something else." She turned to the corner where a pile of broken drones sat. Among them was Betsy, the one she'd fixed days ago. "We load her with an EMP charge, small but strong enough to fry their core relay if it lands right. Then we fly her in during shift change. They'll think it's another decoy." Kyle shook his head. "They'll shoot her down before she gets halfway." "Not if they're distracted," Dan said slowly. He looked at Kyle. "Remember the old lava tube under Sector 7? The one we sealed after the last quake?" Kyle's eyes lit up. "It runs right under their base. If we send a team through it," Dan continued, "we can trigger a small collapse on the far side, just enough noise and dust to draw their eyes. While they're looking that way, Betsy slips in from the opposite side. It was risky. The lava tube was unstable. One wrong step could bring the whole tunnel down, and if the timing was off by even a few seconds, the EMP would fizzle against active shields. But it was their only shot." They gathered the remaining soldiers, 8 in total, including Eli, who insisted on coming despite his limp. They checked weapons that barely worked, packed what little gear they had, and said quiet goodbyes to those staying behind to guard the outpost. No one spoke of failure. They only spoke of doing their part. That night, under the dim red glow of the dying star, the team moved out. They entered the lava tube through a hidden hatch near the outpost's old mining bay. The air inside was hot and thick, smelling of sulfur and old rock. Their helmet lights cut thin beams through the darkness. Every footstep echoed. Every breath sounded too loud. Lena led the way, reading a handheld scanner that showed the tunnel's weak points. Dan followed close behind, rifle ready. Kyle brought up the rear, watching their backs. Eli moved slowly but steadily, jaw clenched against the pain in his leg. Above them, the Krell base hummed with routine activity. Shift change was in 20 minutes. They had to be ready. Back at the outpost, the remaining soldiers launched Betsy. She buzzed into the sky, low and quiet, her signal masked to look like a glitch in the Krell's own systems. On the command ship, General Vraktor watched the feed. He saw the tiny drone, but he didn't order it shot down. He wanted to see what the humans would do next. Something in him had changed. He no longer saw them as enemies to crush. He saw them as a puzzle to solve. Below, the human team reached the spot beneath the Krell base. Lena marked the ceiling with chalk. "This is it. One charge here should crack the rock just enough to make noise, not cause a full collapse." Dan set the charge. They all backed away. He pressed the detonator. A low rumble shook the tunnel. Dust rained down. Far above, alarms blared in the Krell camp. Soldiers rushed toward the sound, weapons raised, scanning for intruders. At that exact moment, Betsy reached the edge of the base. The Krell shields flickered, shift change. 12 seconds. She dove. The EMP charge hit the main relay hub and exploded in a silent burst of energy. Lights across the base went dark. Machines shut down. Shields dropped completely. But the humans weren't done. Lena had one more trick. Before they left the outpost, she'd rerouted every bit of spare power into the old orbital defense cannon, a weapon everyone thought was dead. It hadn't fired in years, but now with the Krell shields down and their systems rebooting, it had a clear shot. From the outpost, a lone technician pressed the firing sequence. The cannon hummed to life, glowing blue in the dark. It fired not a blast of destruction, but a focused energy pulse, designed not to kill but to disable. It struck the Krell base's central command node, frying non-lethal systems, comms, navigation, weapon locks. No one died, but the entire base was suddenly blind and silent. On the command ship, Vraktor watched his screens go black. His officers shouted in panic, but he stood very still. He saw what had happened. The humans hadn't tried to slaughter his troops. They had chosen precision over power, mercy over massacre, and they had won. The human team made it back through the tunnel just as the first Krell scouts reached the collapse site. They were exhausted, covered in dust, but alive. When they stumbled into the outpost, the others cheered, not loudly but with real joy. They had done it. They had turned the tide. High above, Vractor stared at the silent base below. His fleet could still glass the moon from orbit. He could end this in minutes, but he didn't give the order. Instead, he turned to his aide and said, "Record everything. Every move they made. Every choice," then he added, so softly no one else heard. "These human soldiers are unbelievable. Down on the surface." Dan, Lena, and Kyle stood together at the window, looking up at the unmoving Krell ships. They didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in weeks, they felt something like hope. They had fought not with more guns or bigger ships, but with brains, heart, and trust in each other. And somehow that had been enough. The Krell ships stayed in orbit, silent and still, like great black stones hanging in the red sky. No more attacks came. No more drones. No more threats. Inside the outpost, the humans waited, weapons ready but hearts unsure. They had won a battle, but they knew the war wasn't over. Yet something felt different. The air didn't hum with tension anymore. It felt like the calm after a storm that never broke. Then, without warning, a signal came through the comms console. Not a weapon lock. Not a warning blast. A message. In broken but clear English, it said, "General Vractor requests direct communication." Kyle Brooks stared at the screen. "Is this a trick?" Lena shook her head slowly. "If they wanted us dead, they'd just fire. They don't need to talk." Dan wiped his hands on his pants. "Then we answer. But we stay sharp." They patched the main display together using spare parts and linked it to the Krell frequency. A moment later, the face of General Vractor filled the screen. He was tall, his skin rough like old stone, his eyes deep and dark. Scars ran across his face like maps of past wars. He looked tired but not angry. Behind him, the walls of his command ship glowed with strange symbols. "I speak to the leaders of the human defense," he said, his voice deep and slow, shaped by a translator. Kyle stepped forward. "This is Lieutenant Kyle Brooks. I speak for my unit." Vractor studied him, then glanced at Dan and Lena standing nearby. "You have held this moon against my forces for 12 days. You have no reinforcements, no supplies, no hope of victory, yet you fight. Why?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't a taunt. It sounded like he truly wanted to know. Kyle didn't hesitate. "Because someone has to," Lena added, "and because we don't leave anyone behind." Vractor was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your tactics were clever. Your will stronger than I believed possible. I offer you this: surrender the outpost. Give me your tactical logs, your battle data, your recordings of your decisions. In return, I will grant safe passage for all your soldiers, living and wounded, to leave this moon. My ships will escort you to neutral space." The humans exchanged glances. It sounded too good to be true. But they had nothing left to lose. Dan spoke up. "All of us. Every single one. Even those in cryostasis. Even Eli, he can barely walk." Vractor nodded once. "All. And no tricks," Lena said. "No trackers on our shuttles. No ambushes halfway." "I give my word as a Krell commander," Vractor said. "My honor is bound to this offer." In Krell culture, a commander's word was final. To break it was worse than death. The humans knew this from old intelligence files. They believed him, but Kyle wasn't done. "The data you want, it's not just files. It's why we did what we did. If you take it, you have to understand it's not about winning. It's about standing together." Vractor's eyes narrowed slightly. "I do not yet understand your ways, but I wish to." That was enough. Over the next few hours, the humans prepared to leave. They gathered their wounded, loaded them onto stretchers, and carried them to the 2 remaining shuttles in the hangar bay. Eli walked with a limp but refused help. The cryopods, holding 3 soldiers too injured to wake, were carefully moved and secured. Lena uploaded their logs onto a single data crystal. Every decision, every trap, every moment of doubt and courage. She held it in her hand for a long moment before sealing it in a case. Outside, Krell dropships landed at a safe distance, their ramps lowering to show empty holds. No soldiers came out. No weapons were raised. It was a gesture of trust. As the last human boarded the shuttle, Dan turned back to look at the outpost. It was broken, scorched, half buried in dust, but it had held. It had been their home, their fortress, their last stand. He felt a lump in his throat but said nothing. Inside the lead shuttle, Kyle activated the comms one last time. General Vraktor, we're ready. On the command ship, Vraktor watched the feed. He saw the humans helping each other climb aboard. He saw Lena hand the data crystal to a Krell envoy who approached alone, unarmed. He saw Dan give a final salute to the ruined dome before stepping inside. He gave the order. Escort them to the edge of Dominion space. Do not interfere. Do not follow beyond the border. His officers obeyed without question. For the first time in the history of the Krell Dominion, an enemy had walked away from a battlefield not as prisoners, but as honored adversaries. As the shuttles lifted off, trailing smoke and fire into the red sky, the humans inside stayed silent. No cheers, no tears, just relief deep and quiet. They had survived. Not because they were stronger or better armed, but because they refused to let each other fall. High above, Vraktor stood at his viewport, watching the tiny ships grow smaller. He held the data crystal in his hand. It was warm as if it carried the heat of human will. He thought of the song they had sung in the dark. The way they shared water, the way they carried their wounded, the way they chose mercy over destruction when they had the upper hand. He turned to his aide. Mark this system as off-limits. No Krell forces are to enter Epsilon space without my direct command. The aide bowed. Yes, General. Vraktor didn't move. He kept watching until the shuttles vanished into the stars. Then he whispered so softly only he could hear, We do not conquer what we do not understand, and I do not yet understand humans. Down on the moon, the outpost stood empty. Wind blew through its broken halls. Dust settled on abandoned gear. But the spirit of those who had held it remained, in every trap they'd set, every wall they'd defended, every choice they'd made when no one was watching. And far away, in the belly of a Krell warship, a general who had once believed only in power now carried a small piece of something else. Curiosity, respect, maybe even the first seed of change. The humans were gone. But their story had just begun to spread. Months passed. The red glow of Epsilon 9 faded into memory, replaced by the soft blue skies of New Terra, a quiet colony world far from the front lines. Dan Harris sat on a wooden bench outside a small medical rehab center, watching clouds drift across the sky. His leg still ached from an old wound, but he could walk without help now. Nearby, Lena Ortiz tinkered with a broken radio, her fingers moving with the same quick precision they'd used to rewire drones in the dark. She wasn't in uniform anymore, but she still wore her dog tags under her shirt. Kyle Brooks stood by the fence talking quietly with Eli, whose limp had improved but whose eyes still held the weight of what they'd been through. They were healing slowly in body and mind. None of them spoke much about the moon. They didn't need to. They had been there together. That was enough. Back on Earth, news of their stand had spread, but not as a grand victory. Command called it a tactical delay. The public barely noticed. There were bigger wars, newer threats. But in certain circles, military academies, strategy rooms, quiet bars where old soldiers gathered, the name Epsilon 9 was spoken with respect. Not because they won a battle, but because they showed what humans could do when backed into a corner with nothing but each other. Far away, beyond the edge of known space, things were changing too. The Krell Dominion, once a relentless tide of conquest, had stopped its advance along the Orion Arm. Scout ships reported strange behavior, Krell patrols avoiding human-inhabited systems, even when lightly defended. Trade routes once seized without warning were now left untouched. Whispers traveled through alien ports and neutral stations. Some said the Krell had grown weak, others said they had grown wise. Aboard his flagship, General Vraktor sat alone in his war room. The data crystal from Epsilon 9 rested on his desk, glowing faintly whenever he played it. He had watched the footage hundreds of times. The song, the shared rations, the way Kyle held a dying soldier's hand. He no longer saw foolishness in those acts. He saw strength of a kind his empire had never valued, strength that came not from fear but from care. He had ordered his top scholars to study human history, not as enemies, but as a puzzle. They read old Earth texts about compassion, sacrifice, community. They analyzed human art, music, even children's stories. At first, his officers thought he had lost his mind, but Vraktor didn't care. He had seen something on that moon that changed him. He realized that a species willing to die for each other was far harder to break than one that fought only for survival. One day, He called a meeting of his highest commanders. "We will not attack human worlds," he announced. "Not now. Not ever, unless they strike first," murmurs filled the room. "But General," one commander said, "they are weak. Their technology is crude. Their numbers are scattered." Fractor looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "They are not weak. They are different. And difference is not weakness. It is danger we do not yet understand." He did not say it aloud, but he knew the truth. If the Krell kept fighting humans the old way, they might win battles, but they would lose something greater, their own soul. The humans had shown him that war could be fought with honor, even in defeat. And that was a lesson no weapon could teach. On New Terra, the three soldiers sat together one evening as the sun set. They didn't talk about the future. They just sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind in the trees. A message had come from Earth Command weeks ago, offering them medals, promotions, quiet retirements. They had all said no, not because they hated the service, but because they wanted peace. Real peace. Not the kind that comes after victory, but the kind that comes after surviving something no one thought you could. Lena finally broke the silence. "You ever wonder if they're still watching us?" Dan smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I hope they learned something." Kyle looked up at the stars. "I hope they learned we're not monsters. Just people trying to protect our own." None of them knew that their actions had rippled across the galaxy. They didn't know that Krell children in distant cities were now taught human stories in secret. They didn't know that Vraktor had ordered a new doctrine written, one that valued restraint, study, and understanding over blind conquest. All they knew was that they were alive, and that they had each other. Back on his ship, Vraktor played the footage one last time that night, the humans singing in the dark. He turned off the screen and sat in silence. For the first time in his life, he felt something he had no name for. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was respect, deep, quiet, and unshakable. He kept the data crystal on his desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that the strongest warriors are not always the ones with the biggest guns, but the ones who refuse to let go of each other, even when the universe tries to pull them apart. And so, in two corners of the galaxy, on a quiet colony world and aboard a mighty warship, two very different beings carried the same truth in their hearts, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand together in spite of it. The war wasn't over, but something had shifted, and sometimes that's enough to change everything.